Welcome to the Life Science Success Podcast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm a consultant in life sciences. I focus in on helping companies with people, process, and technology. And so, with that, let me bring in my guest. So, this week in Life Science Success Podcast, my guest is Dr. Carolyn Ward. Carolyn is a trailblazing, if I can get it out, internal medicine physician and advocate for patient empowerment. So, with that, welcome, Carolyn.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being here. And I'm really excited about this topic. As we were talking before we went live, a bit of my dissertation work was focused on electronic health records. So I'm really interested to dive into this. First of all, can you just spend a little bit of time and introduce yourself and describe what led you to specialize in internal medicine?
Yeah, absolutely. I am originally from New Jersey. I did all of my medical training in New Jersey at Rutgers Robert Wood, and I did my residency, chief residency in internal medicine there as well. And I really chose internal medicine because I feel like it's really like the breadth of medicine. If you think of the specialties as like the depth, and I liked it because it's really challenging. You get to see a lot of different things. You're seeing patients with all different types of diseases and disease ranges and socioeconomic backgrounds. And there's also a lot of innovation in the actual care delivery models. Not to say that outside of internal medicine there isn't, but primary care, specifically in acute hospital care, they do tend to be like the first arenas where a lot of these different new interventions and new care delivery models get pushed out or trialed. And so that was really interesting to me. And so I have practiced in a lot of different settings. I've worked at like a major academic hospital. I've worked at a health tech startup practicing medicine. I've done inpatient, I've done outpatient. So I've kind of tried all over the place, and it's definitely been a really fun ride so far.
Oh, that's great. And then what led you from there to want to join Particle Health?
Yeah, so I was previous to Particle, I was actually working at Forward, which is a health tech startup in primary care. And I had a great time there in the sense that I was able to practice primary care with an emphasis on prevention, which I really loved. But with any startup, you kind of get to wear a lot of different hats. And so I was able to work on a lot of different products and standing up some digital health apps and programs. And it was during my time there, I realized that I really liked the product work. And I wanted to get my feet wet and understand whether or not this was something that I would want to pursue full time as opposed to practicing medicine full time. And ultimately, I decided that I did feel it aligned better with my strengths. It was very interesting, it was very creative. And so I ended up applying for jobs and I ended up at Particle because I felt Particle was tackling this really big challenge, which is clinical data in our healthcare system. And from my perspective and during my experience, what I realized was the ability to capture data and then transfer it to the different points in time, to the different providers, to the different people and different locations is a huge challenge that affects patient experience. It affects clinical outcomes. It affects physician burnout. And so I was like, you know what? I want to be at a company that's tackling this problem. And that's definitely what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and so I mean, what's interesting to me is that transition as well between people who see patients directly, and then now you're much more on the product side. As a director of clinical strategy at Particle Health, do you at all get to interact with patients now, or are you one step still removed in on the product side?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I mostly interact with providers or provider organizations in the C suite, essentially. And I think that's a really interesting question because of two things. Number one, I think a lot of people do go into medicine because they like the patient facing work, they like to interact with people and obviously help them. And I think medicine is truly one of the unique opportunities where you can go to sleep every night knowing you made an impact in somebody's life. And that is a very unique experience. And I definitely appreciated a lot of my time practicing medicine in a patient facing way. But ultimately, what really made me want to transition over was the amount of impact you can make. And can you actually scale that impact in a way that affects the entire healthcare system in the United States and thereby be able to affect millions of people's lives, right? And so I think that, when it comes to clinical data, there are kind of there's a lot of ways to slice it, but there are kind of two halves, right? One is like the providers who need the data, and then there's the patients who want access to their own data. And it's interesting that I don't really interface too much with patients, and a huge part of that is Particle was actually founded on the promise of individual access, meaning
Mm,
that individuals would have access to their health records, which is currently a mandate in the United States today. But the truth is that the vast majority of organizations do not have a way to actually digitally transfer your records to you. So we do have things like one-off patient portals where you have to like remember every login you've ever made. Every place you go has a different patient portal, and it's very hard to extract data out of those patient portals. And you definitely can't combine them really either. Or you could, like, for example, if you've ever been hospitalized and you said, I want my records from that hospital visit, like the main way that the vast majority of people get those records is to go down to the records department, probably in the basement of that hospital, request your records, and they will print you out a 200-page paper file of those records. And so that's why a lot of patients would come into me with their 3-ring binder of things, right? Which was great. I'm like, okay, like you've taken the effort to collate all this information, but we also live in a world where like that effort probably shouldn't be on the patient to do
right.
that. And so we want to say, hey, can we actually get people access? And where we are right now in the market and in the industry is predominantly the ability to digitally exchange data is still under the treatment purpose of use, meaning it is primarily from a provider asking another provider for data on a patient that they're actively treating to help with a treatment decision. But we definitely want to push more and more into individual access because both me and obviously the founder of Particle, Troy Bannister, believe really heavily that obviously patients should have access to their own healthcare data, which seems obvious, but
Yeah, and that ability, once it is in paper, I mean, getting it back digital is a foregone detail. I feel like now. But
absolutely.
your answer was a great lead into my next question, which really is, who is Particle Health, and then who does Particle Health serve?
Yeah, so Particle Health is a clinical data platform. And essentially, what we do is we can pull down patient data under the treatment purpose of use from the national networks and combine that data. So, for example, I used to live in New Jersey, so some of my health records live with the providers in New Jersey. I now live in California, so some of my health records are in California. And if I was going to a new provider, they probably want to be able to see all of those records combined together to get a holistic understanding of like who is Carolyn, how has she interacted with the healthcare system in the past, what has happened to her, and therefore to try to understand like what do I need to do for her to have a high quality of life, right? And so what we do is essentially go out and we look for that data. We figure out for this individual patient where are they likely to have generated data across the healthcare ecosystem in the United States. Let's go ahead and get that data from those facilities, combine it together, and then surface insights from that data. So whether you are an organization that just wants all of the data, we can go ahead and pass you that full data package. But what we're finding is a lot of provider orgs, that's just a lot of information.
Yeah.
And so what they really need help with is actually mining the insights, right? So when I look at all of the data that Carolyn has generated in her lifetime for her in her healthcare, compared to just a slice of the pie that an individual provider might see in their EHR, what are the unique insights that I'm actually able to lift from that data that would be different or would look different or maybe be less accurate if you only had a slice of the pie? And so that's kind of our current mission.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think though too that I mean, many of us, and I'm very much included in this. I forget, my wife normally reminds me how many times that we've moved, throughout our lifetime, and I want to say it's more than 20. So out of all
Wow.
of those moves, imagine how many healthcare providers that I've had throughout my lifetime. Piecing all of that data together is almost impossible, but I could tell you like the big places that I've been throughout my life that probably generated the most amount of information. And it would be interesting to have all of it with my healthcare provider if they needed it to make a decision, right? And then Lord knows how much, how tough that would be as well. Really to try and dive through that data without having the ability of an organization like Particle Health to help you.
Exactly. And so if you think about it, in the last maybe handful of years, we're seeing a lot of new telehealth players, digital health players.
Mm,
And so our care and where our data lives is getting more and more fragmented, right? Because maybe you go to some local hospital, you have your primary care physician, some health system, but occasionally go to like some rando urgent care down the street, and you also have like some telehealth provider. that is like a digital health startup or something that you see virtually that comes with your health insurance. So now it's like you're generating data all over the place, and you're not going to be able to, as an individual patient, probably remember all the places that you've gone. And it is a lot of data. And so even when you are able to fetch all that data, pull it back together, now the question really becomes like, how do you make signal from that noise?
Right.
And can you actually create an engine that runs on top of that data that can tell you like, hey, when I look at all of the data, these are the trends that I'm seeing. Carolyn is using the healthcare system in a different way than she used to in the past. Or it could be high level things from a population level, or even an individual utilization level trends, all the way down to like, hey, this is what happened to her on her most recent lab work. And it was, not in the normal range. Or, hey, we think that, this disease she has is progressing because of X, Y, and Z that we see in the data. So it's exciting.
Also important. So throughout your career, there must have been a pivotal moment or maybe several pivotal moments that then led you to want to focus in on clinical strategy. What were those for you?
I think probably the first big one was during my chief resident year, was just when COVID was starting,
Mm.
and New Jersey got hit really hard. Same with New York, obviously, and multiple parts of the country. And it was during that experience I was helping to lead a group of 70 residents, where the internal medicine residency program at that time decided to take on seeing all of the COVID patients in the hospital. And it was a really scary time in that, like, we didn't know about much about COVID. A lot of people were dying from it. We're like, is it being transmitted by droplets? Is it like, how long is it staying in the air? Is it being transmitted on surfaces? Like, there's just a lot of unknowns at that time. So people were really scared to, be on shift in the hospital and go home to their loved ones. Right. And that was a moment where I learned a lot about hospitals and how they work, how they procure equipment, what logistics and operations looks like. But it was also a big time where like we realized that we had a lack of like an accurate, timely pipeline of clinical data. So
Mm.
all of these different places, these major academic hospitals that were seeing a vast bulk of COVID cases, they didn't really have a way to actually mine the data that they were generating for research. So we can
Yeah.
say like, hey, these are the high level trends based off of the, 1,000 COVID patients we've just seen. Like, this is what we found. And I feel like at that time I thought to myself, if we were able to do that, we probably would find findings faster and understand quicker, like, how is this transmitted? What is most effective? Like, what should we be doing? Where should these patients be in the hospital? Right. And so that was kind of, I think, my first inkling where I was like, I feel like there's something here that I'm interested in at working on at a system wide, higher impact level. Um, and then afterwards, when I was at Forward, that was when I was like, okay, I think one of the really interesting things about kind of a lot of the new startups in the primary care space, it's kind of twofold. Number one is what I call personalization. So there's a huge demand on the market right now for patients to get personalized care, meaning patients, when they go into the doctor, they don't want super generic advice, right? Like, when people are like, look, I want to lose weight, the last thing they want to hear is like, okay, diet and exercise. Because and it's not that that doesn't work, but it's so generic it basically doesn't work, right? Like, what people really want to know is like, what should I actually be eating to optimize my health? What exercises should I be doing, right? And like, I think we're seeing a lot more of that on the market, for that demand on the market. And so I think a huge part of that, to me at least, speaks to also a clinical data problem. Like, can we actually use clinical data to build a digital twin of a person based off the data that they have generated, so that I can actually give them personalized individual outcomes and tell you, like, as a person, this is what you should be doing. And if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. What are those predictive lenses that we can take? What are those probabilities? And I think like we really are getting to a point in the industry like that is the level of detail that people demand. And so I would love to see um, a lot of the AI in this space take over that personalization. And the second thing is that people want new ways of care delivery, right?
Mm.
Like, we for sure, there's still a place for going in to see a physician, but more and more people are saying, hey, I want to be able to connect with providers in my day to day life at my convenience. And that's why we're seeing a lot of these new models pop up. And so that I think was a very interesting problem for me. And that's ultimately why I said, okay, I want to learn a little bit more about this clinical data problem and see what I can contribute here.
What came to mind to me as you were going through that as well is just all of the devices that all of us wear as well, and the I mean the reality that my healthcare provider really doesn't get very much today from the devices that I wear. And then for people that have like continuous glucose monitors and other things, I mean, I know that they can get the data, but at the same time being able to incorporate that in terms of a true digital twin, really would be powerful, I would imagine, as both a healthcare provider and as a patient.
Absolutely. And so if you think about it, like there, I have had patients all the time be like, "Hey, can I like sync up my Apple Watch to the EHR so you can see like all the data I'm generating?" And as a provider, like most providers, like that's my worst nightmare of like being
Mm.
responsible to look at like every heartbeat that you've generated over the last month. Like, and the truth is that that data as a whole doesn't really make sense because I don't understand the context of it, right?
Hmm.
And that's one of the complicated things about clinical data is that the context matters so heavily. So your heart rate went high. Were you running? Were you sleeping? Like what was happening when that happened, right? And outside of that context, like that doesn't really tell me very much. But what is interesting is if you're on your Apple Watch, you'll see that there, or on that like Apple Health Kit app, you'll see that there's a section called trends.
Hmm.
And I think like in healthcare, that is where what I would love to see more of built into EHRs within different software platforms of understanding like, okay, I don't necessarily have to see like every step you took every second of the day, but if I could see like how trends have changed over time, that I think is really powerful.
Yeah, and I'm somebody who my watch has told me before that my resting heart rate changed, and I remember at that point in my life, like a few things had changed in my life along with it. So, I'm looking for the signal that says it went back, but I haven't seen that either. So, hopefully, one of these days it says, "Hey, look, you took the right steps, and by the way, your resting heart rate has gone back to the way it was before." But so, as you think about, kind of this. You have this passion for patient empowerment. How do you see Particle Health's mission aligning with, where your personal and professional goals are?
Yeah, I think that right now we're starting off in the provider space in the sense that we want to make sure that providers who are treating patients have the full clinical context they need to be able to make the most accurate decisions. And so if you think about fragmented care leading to fragmented data, that probably means that any given provider seeing a patient at point of care is really only operating on a small segment of that data. And the smaller the segment, the less likely that their decision making will be accurate. And so we want to try to go in and solve that problem to say, hey, we can actually go ahead and find and ingest all of the data this person has generated so that when you go to make a particular decision at bedside, you have the confidence that you are doing it with all the information that's out there. Medicine is always going to be a very gray zone. You're never going to know with 100% certainty pretty much anything. But it's really about like, how can you level that risk, right? And so
Mm.
I really see clinical data access as being around risk management for providers and for patients. That being said, when it comes to patient empowerment, I actually think having access to your own data is a huge part about empowering patients. One, because when you understand what is going on in your health, you're much more likely to engage the healthcare system in a positive way and engage in your own life and lifestyle in a positive way. And number two, when you have access to that data and you have somebody who can kind of like lead you and educate you, you're actually much more empowered to advocate for yourself within our healthcare system. And given how convoluted and complex our system is, like the ability to advocate for yourself makes a huge difference in outcomes.
Yeah, I would imagine. I would imagine so. As you think about your position inside of Particle Health, what are your overall primary responsibilities in and objectives in enhancing healthcare through technology?
Yeah, I work very heavily with our product teams. Essentially, one of my major responsibilities is to define and look through different use cases for data, primarily in the provider space, although we are also dabbling in a few other secondary markets, but primarily say, hey, as a provider, what are the different work streams that I use data in, which is basically every work stream. But can I actually like define those as use cases? And then can I create clinical data schemas that say, these are the data elements I would need to do this X, Y, and Z action, right? So an example I'll give is pretty specifically, it could be something like, my organization wants to stand up a GLP-1 workflow where we can triage people, understand who is contraindicated for a GLP-1, who rolls in, and then actually meet them where they are and work with them on weight management, whether that is with or without medication. That also requires data, right? In order to see if somebody is able to take a GLP-1 or is eligible for one, you need certain data points about their history, their personal medical history, things that they've tried in their past, their BMI. So there's both structured and unstructured data that you're really looking for. And so it's my job to say, hey, for this particular use case or workflow, these are the 15 to 25 data elements or fields that would be useful for us to pull out of the health record and take a look at. It could also be something a little bit more nebulous or broad, like onboarding. So like if you're a provider, you're seeing a patient for the first time, you don't know anything about them. What are the main things that I need to know to get a good sense of who this person is prior to me having a conversation about whatever it is that brought them in today? And so it can be something super granular all the way up to like something kind of nebulous, where we have to start to understand two things. One, what data elements people find important in that particular situation. And then two, what are the relationships between these data elements and how is it useful to be able to map them so that when a physician's picking up a particular data element to look at, they see the context of everything else.
Very good. Yeah. So I mean, I kind of, just to pull out a couple of threads that they hear there though too. What I could envision would be that if you're taking certain medicines and you wind up at the physician, particles capability, could be that maybe you're providing, hey, look, there could be an interaction here. And your position more specifically is saying these data points are the ones that you probably want to pay attention to in that particular case. Is that
That's
correct?
exactly right. And so there are so many workflows in healthcare that require data, obviously, almost all of them. And so we work pretty closely with our customers and our partners to be able to say, hey, what gives you the biggest bang for your buck in your particular organization? And so we focus primarily in value-based care, where organizations are risk-bearing and are saying, we are willing to take on the risk and be accountable fully for this patient's outcomes. And those type of organizations, basically what they really need is an ability to manage the risk, to
Hmm.
understand what risk they're actually taking on and then manage that risk. And you do that with data, right? Without really knowing who this person is, how they interact with the healthcare system, what are their conditions, what do they need help with, where are they on the disease spectrum. There's really no way to actually know how much risk you're even taking on when you say you're going to go take on that patient. And then of course that trickles down to, how do you mitigate that risk?
Right.
So
And how does particle health solutions today, kind of reach the broader healthcare ecosystem?
yeah, so we are an API first company. So that is makes it pretty flexible to pull this data in once we have it into whatever software platform you might be using. And so whether that's surfacing it in a proprietary EHR that you've built or some other software platform or an app, or however your company has built your user interface, um, or straight up into your analytics engine is another way that a lot of customers use our data. The API integration makes it super easy to be able to call for that information and get it pretty quickly. We also have a UI. So for a lot of our customers who don't have their own UI, or they just want to stand up something really quickly for their care coordination teams, their care management teams, or their physicians, to be able to quickly look in and see some clinical context about a patient, that's primarily what we use that for as well.
Very good. Eh, So it's been a long time since I've been in the medical record interoperability world. Can you tell us a little bit more about the unique challenges that you face today in terms of interoperability?
Oh, yes, there are so many. I would say that the first one is that when we pull data together, the data itself is very messy. So the way that EHRs push data back out to the networks is not uniform. And
Mm.
so they all come back in the same type of data format, which is CCDA, but the templates are all different. Where somebody decides to put a piece of information is different. And a lot of our customers today, they can't really use CCDA because it's not a really searchable like format, right? You really have to go in and pretty manually look for the exact piece of information that you want. So we'll often transform that data into FHIR so that, certain pieces of data are going into a certain resource bucket. So when you look for labs, for example, you know exactly where to go and look for those labs. And then obviously we also produce a flattened JSON format as well, which is really easy that you can pull into like a tabular format, like even into Excel to do some easy analytics on. But generally, I would say like the data itself, parsing it is quite messy. Even for fully structured fields, the way that the data gets transmitted from an EHR, even to us in that first step in CCDA, a lot of that data is, number one, it's in an unstructured format. I'm not even just talking about like it's in free text notes,
Mm.
but like it might be in a PDF, like in an image of text, right? And so the fact that data is trapped within EHRs in this kind of way makes it really hard to pull out that comprehensive data. And then when you actually go out and you pull all these records together, there's a ton of duplicates, right? Because, maybe you went to Mayo Clinic and Mayo Clinic had requested some fax records from Johns Hopkins for you in the past. And now we also go out and look for Johns Hopkins records. And now suddenly we have two of those records, right? And so we have to go through and cleanse all that data so that we have a full understanding of like, hey, these data elements together truly represent one event that has happened in time. And when you get the data back, that one event is represented in probably like 25 different ways. And so how do we actually build logic to cleanse the data in a way that, one, definitely does not delete data, but two, allows it to be deduplicated to a point where it's actually useful, right? Like it would actually be useful to show this to somebody and they would be able to look at it and say, okay, I understand chronologically what has actually happened here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean such an important thing, and it's interesting to hear because of I think master data in general across all of healthcare is one of those challenges that we all face, and it's not just necessarily on the electronic data that's being generated. There's certainly plenty of manual data that's being generated that also comes in duplicated and things like that, where you have to have systems oftentimes to say, no, this thing is the same thing I've already counted once, so I'm not going to count it again, and have that logic. I would imagine one of the bigger challenges has to be just that level of patient privacy as well as security, in that as well, and so what are some of the things that that you deal with in terms of patient privacy and security?
Yes, absolutely. So this is a really great point, something we talk a lot about internally. So of course we have like a ton of security measures and certifications like High Trust and SOC 2, just to, make sure that our data that we have access to is secure. But at the same time, I think the other side of privacy is who should have access to an individual patient's data, right? And so when you have a treatment relationship, I feel like that's relatively clear in that like the person provider who's taking care of you needs access to your healthcare data to actually take care of you, right? But there's a lot of other purposes of use, other organizations that want access to that data. So life sciences is a great one, biopharma is a great one. Also, like in some cases, lawyers, insurance companies, life insurance companies, like there's a lot of other use cases for healthcare data. And I think generally in the United States, there's a lot of regulations about how you would pass that data along and when and to whom you would pass that data. I would say generally Particle is very conservative there because we want to make sure at minimum, nobody who should not have access to your data has access to your data, right? That's an absolute no-no. And I think another part of that for us is the patient matching. So when we go out and look for Carolyn Ward's data, there's probably a lot of people named Carolyn Ward. And there's probably also some people named Carolyn Ward that has the same birth date as me. And we also know when we go out and look for data that a lot of people, their name is misspelled in the EHR, or they included their middle name over here and they didn't include it in this one, right? And that's so how do you even go out and say with definitive certainty, yes, this is the person that I am looking for when you're looking at all these different endpoints, right? And the answer is like, you can't. You're never going to be able to really say with 100% certainty, like, this is definitely the person. What you have to do is create like probabilistic matching. and say, I need to set a threshold in which I will say, if I cannot meet this threshold, that is not the right piece of data. Like, I'm not passing along that data. Most EHRs have a threshold where they say, like, if I cannot guarantee that up to a certain percentage that this is Carolyn Ward, the Carolyn Ward you're looking for, I'm not going to respond with data. We also, of course, implement our own like double checks when we pull data back, even when we have been passed data, to confirm that, yes, we believe that all the records that you just sent me truly are for Carolyn Ward, because we also know that in healthcare data, in a non-negligible portion of the EHRs, there's probably other people's records in your record. And
Ah,
as a patient, we don't really necessarily are not really aware of that, but that is a pretty well-known phenomenon in the industry. So there's always that chance. And so what we want to do is, how close to zero can we drive that risk? And so we have to set up these different checkpoints along the way to constantly be double checking and making sure we're passing along the correct person's data to the right person.
very interesting. Yeah, and to think about the just the knot overall that you have to try and untangle to try and figure that out. As you're going through that, a guy with the name Don Davis is probably pretty intertwined somewhere somewhere in some medical system with my data, but who knows. Um, the one other thing that came to mind as well is just this idea of the power of this information and the sort of time that we're living in. I feel like this is kind of the optimal time, both for AI as well as just in general, having the ability to have large data sets for people to take a look at. What are your thoughts in terms of the future for this technology? Where would you like to see it go? Not holding you to
Oh, yeah.
any future telling here. I know that we don't have a crystal ball, but it would be interesting to get your perspective.
Yeah, I am really for creating like data digital twins for people, in the sense of, one, kind of what we've talked about, which is, can I actually understand to a very granular level who this person is based off the data that they've generated, and therefore make predictive insights of like what we should be doing for them, what actions they should be taking, or if not, left to their own devices, what does this model tell us about what will happen to this person, right? And what it comes down to me is, first of all, I'll say, I think we're seeing some of this already, specifically in the genomics and oncology space, where we are getting a lot of personalized medicine to be able to say, hey, based off the data that we know about you, you probably are at risk for this particular diagnosis by this percentage. Or you may have a particular kind of cancer, you're most likely to respond to treatment A instead of treatment B. Where I would love to see this go is to pull that all the way through into primary care, and not just in the oncology and rare diseases space, but in the super common chronic care space, where we say, right now, you have high blood pressure. Okay, I'm going to start you on probably lisinopril, right? But can we get to a point where we understand, actually, out of all the ACE inhibitors, or out of all the ARBs, which one actually works best for Don? Right?
Mm,
As opposed to, generally in the population, this one works best. Well, what about Don? Like, that's what Don cares about, right? It's like,
right.
which one's going to work best for me, not just like generally in the United States. And so that's what I would love to be able to see. And I think we're going to be able to pull that all the way through to also like exercise and diet and nutrition. And when you think about it in that framework, you realize probably in the future, what we consider to be healthcare data is going to be a lot broader, right? It's probably going to be your wearable devices. It's going to be where you live, what you eat. Do you live in a food desert? What do you do for work? How sedentary are you? All of those things are probably going to be considered healthcare data in the future, because we know that all those things affect your health. And we don't have a great way to actually capture and marry those data sources today. And that's where I would love to see this go. And the other half of that is understanding risk, right? And
Mm.
understanding kind of two parts, I would say, which is, one, what is this person at risk for? What is Carolyn at risk for based off of her current habits, her current lifestyle, her family history? And then how much of that risk can we actually affect? So there's some people who are going to die no matter what you do. They're going to develop a certain disease no matter what you do. Not all risk is able to be mitigated. So I think that we also need to get a better understanding of like, what percentage of this risk can we change, right? And then how do we actually change it? And if we don't understand the first question, we can't really get to the second question, which I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of people trying a bunch of different things in the healthcare space most of them don't really affect patient outcomes. And
Yeah.
so, can we use this access to data to marry those processes a little bit closer so that when we're iterating on, hey, how can we affect this person's outcome, we can get to the right answer a little faster?
Very good. Carolyn, there are three questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
I think what inspires me is seeing the recent boom in healthcare startups. It's such a complicated industry to be part of. Their problems are so hard to solve, but I'm still seeing a ton of companies and people willing to jump in and solve these problems and focus on really hard populations like the rural population, Medicaid populations, like these populations historically that have been really hard to engage, really hard to affect patient outcomes in. And I'm still seeing people willing to like kind of dive headfirst into these problems. And I think that's really inspiring.
Yeah, well, the entrepreneur's mind of, hey, look, I know somebody else has already tried, but I'm gonna try again is something that is always inspiring to me as well. Um, Second question: what concerns you? Sorry.
I would say what concerns me is that the problems are just really hard to solve. And so,
Mm,
what you end up seeing is that a lot of companies end up pivoting to kind of low hanging fruit problems because they're just easier to affect. And, they got to make money to stay alive as a business. And I think that that's hard because the truth is that a lot of the problems that really need solving in healthcare are probably going to take a really long time to actually solve. And if you're a part of like a VC backed startup that needs to be able to show a certain amount of revenue, a certain amount of growth, it's really hard to be able to prioritize a problem that's going to take you well over a decade.
yeah, it's all so true. Last question: what excites you?
I think what's really exciting is that we are getting to a point where we are understanding the vast amount of data that somebody generates and understanding the value of it. And so I'm actually seeing a lot of provider orgs starting to stand up their own data science arm and starting to try to capitalize off of the data that they have so that they can improve healthcare outcomes. And I think, to me, I think a lot of primary care physicians in the future are going to look a lot more like data scientists. And to me, I think we're starting to see the start of that, and that's really exciting.
Very good. Well, Carolyn Ward, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success podcast. And thank you for sharing with us the journey that Particle Health is taking in terms of bringing your technology to the world.
Awesome. This has been great.
Thank you.